My mother's voice always carried more weight when it came without warmth. "Just don't wear anything weird," she said, like I might show up to a military promotion in sequins and combat boots. I could hear her organizing name cards in the background, likely already placing Cyrilla's friends near the head of the table, and me somewhere convenient out of the frame. I thanked her, out of habit, out of survival. I had learned long ago that with some families, politeness passed for presence. Growing up in the Everin household meant learning to march before you could ride a bike. My father, Colonel Jarek Everin, retired after 35 years in strategic command, a man who believed emotion belonged only to civilians. My mother, Leona, served as a medic and walked like she still had pressure sensors under her feet. They didn't raise children so much as mold cadets, and we became exactly what they shaped almost. Cyrilla was the pride, the prodigy. 4 years younger, 2 ranks ahead. Every time she earned another stripe, the family group chat came alive. When I made lieutenant commander, the silence was louder than a reprimand. Not that they knew. I didn't tell them. That's the nature of ghost work. You save lives in shadows and eat dinner alone. They think I dropped out of West Point my first year, that I couldn't handle the discipline. The truth is, I never left. I was redirected, handpicked. My official records became as thin as my place in the family album. There's one photo from that summer barbecue after I withdrew. I remember it well because a cousin told me later that my face was cropped out to balance the shot. Balance. Like I was too heavy to keep in the frame. Now Cyrilla was being promoted at Fort Valor, and I'd been summoned, not invited, just expected. To sit, to smile, to not wear anything weird. I hung up, walked to the closet and pulled out 2 sets of clothes, a soft neutral blouse and my uniform crisp and untouched. One would keep me invisible. The other might burn the whole illusion down. The dining room smelled like lemon polish and polite tension. I arrived 10 minutes early and was still the last to sit. The long oak table had been set with precision silverware aligned like marching formations. My name card tucked near the end beside a flickering votive candle read simply M. Everin. Not even my full name. Just an initial, as if they weren't sure which version of me might show up. Cyrilla moved through the space like she owned it, radiant in pre-ceremony charm polished to the bone. When she reached my corner of the table, she didn't pause. "This is my sister," she said to the group. "She used to be an admin, I think." There was a beat of silence before someone chuckled. A cousin leaned in with a crooked grin. "Hey, better than nothing, right?" I returned the smile. Not wide enough to show teeth, just enough to let the moment pass without scraping too deep. I'd perfected that expression years ago. It was the same one I wore when my father forgot my deployment date, or when my mother introduced me as our other daughter at a retirement gala. No one asked what kind of admin I'd supposedly been. No one asked what I was doing now. That's the thing about erasure, it only works if no one digs. A little girl, maybe 7, tugged on my sleeve during dessert. Cyrilla's niece. "Did you ever shoot a real gun?" she asked, her eyes wide with wonder. I crouched beside her chair, smiled gently. Once I said. But more often I wrote plans that helped soldiers make it home. She blinked, then ran off to play with a plastic tank. Back at the table, my dessert sat untouched. A slice of pie next to a fork I hadn't lifted. I glanced at the empty chair beside me, assigned to someone who never showed up. Maybe they knew better. I kept my medals wrapped in a cloth in my bag by the door. They rattled softly as I stood just enough to remind me they were still there, still mine. There's no ribbon for the mission where you lose people you named in your will. I still remember the smell of diesel and burnt sand outside Al-Hasaka. We were pulling out a logistics officer undercover, compromised, bleeding through gauze I wrapped with my own hands. The exfil went sideways. They called it Candlelight Recon in the after-action file. I never liked that name, too poetic for something so loud and cruel. 3 men died getting that one man out. One of them had a daughter who sent me a friendship bracelet in the mail. I never opened the envelope. I couldn't. In Libya, I spent 4 days wedged between concrete and ductwork in a compound while coordinating a hostage recovery through a pinhole camera. I learned how to hold my breath for 3 full minutes. I learned how to whisper commands that sounded like lullabies. The work was precise, quiet. No medals came with it. No articles. No flags folded and delivered to next of kin with me in the frame. My superiors said I was effective. My family called me missing. They didn't ask why I missed Christmas or why my hands sometimes trembled when the power went out. They assumed I'd simply walked away from structure, that I'd failed the one thing we were all born into: uniformity. This morning, the sky over Fort Valor was slate gray, the kind of weather that hangs over you like unfinished sentences. I stood in front of the closet with 2 hangers in my hand. One held a soft gray blouse and slacks, inoffensive and visible. The other, a navy blue dress uniform decorated not with medals, but with the fine threading of silence and years. The fabric felt heavier than I remembered. My fingers moved across the braid at the shoulder, hesitating just long enough to wonder if I still had the right to wear it. I packed them both, folded with care side by side, one for blending in, one for daring not to. I zipped the case, checked my ID, and stepped toward the door as my phone vibrated again. The hall was dressed in ceremony. Flags, crisp brass fixtures polished to a quiet gleam, and rows of folding chairs aligned like a battle formation. I sat 3 rows from the back in the section labeled Family Unassigned, which felt like its own kind of truth. Cyrilla stood at the front in full dress blues, her shoulders squared with the kind of poise that made people believe she was born for the stage. She opened with a quote about legacy and service. Her voice was steady, polished, already dripping with applause before the first paragraph ended. My name came once. I'm honored my family could be here today, she said, including my sister Marlene. No rank, no history, just the word sister like a vague relative with nothing worth listing. Somewhere near the middle rows, a pair of officers leaned together. One said, "She looks familiar." The other tilted his head unsure. Then the rear doors opened. General Karst entered, not with a flourish, but with that heavy quiet that bends a room without saying a word. His eyes scanned the crowd like a searchlight, passing over rows of uniforms and civilians alike. When he saw me, he stopped, fully, clean and abrupt, like a man hitting a target he didn't expect to find. He stepped forward, 1 pace, then another. The murmur of the audience thinned until it broke completely. He stopped just in front of me and raised his hand in a salute sharp, exact textbook. "General Everin," he said clearly, "it's an honor to see you again." Every chair stilled. A fork clattered somewhere. Cyrilla's voice faltered mid-sentence. My father, seated beside a colonel, blinked hard as if trying to recalibrate what he'd just heard. I rose, returned the salute, not out of pride, but out of respect. Not for him. For the ones I lost. For the ones I led. Karst nodded once and continued to his seat as if nothing had happened. But something had. The room was no longer Cyrilla's. As I sat again, a slow warmth settled beneath my ribs, not triumph, not satisfaction, just the quiet, heavy relief of no longer being mistaken for someone I never was. The room they assigned me wasn't meant for lingering military-issue beige walls, a lamp that buzzed faintly, and a twin bed that creaked when I set my bag down. I closed the door behind me and exhaled slowly, the applause still ringing in my ears, not for me, but for the silence that had finally broken. There was something on the desk, a manila envelope, no markings, no name. I sat down, peeled the flap open, and slid out a single document. Printed in grayscale, several lines redacted. I scanned it once, then again, slower. A forwarded intel report, anonymous sender. Subject line, unauthorized engagement, civilian risk. My name was nowhere on it, but my initials, ME, were embedded in the narrative. The wording was familiar. Too familiar. Whole phrases lifted word for word from a draft I'd written during a post-op analysis 2 years earlier. It was a mission that never made the briefings. A night operation outside Kirkuk that went off book for 10 minutes long enough to save a recon team, but cross an invisible line in the process. Only 3 people had access to that draft: the lead analyst, a junior logistics officer, and Cyrilla. I leaned back in the chair. My eyes burned, but I didn't blink, didn't cry. The betrayal didn't hit like a gunshot. It settled more like a cold hand on the back of the neck, familiar, almost expected. I picked up a pen from the desk and circled the timestamp. It matched a date I'd been flagged briefly for internal review. They called it a systems anomaly back then. Said it cleared itself in a day. Now I knew it hadn't cleared. It had been buried. I folded the document once, twice, and slid it into the inside pocket of my jacket. The same pocket that used to hold classified maps and comm briefings. Now it held a different kind of weapon, one I never wanted to carry. I didn't sleep. I watched the wall until the room dimmed with morning, then reached for my badge as the first knock echoed against the door. The reception buzzed with the afterglow of rank. Officers mingled with donors. Laughter floated above polished glass, and Cyrilla stood in the center of it, all shoulders back smile, rehearsed the embodiment of what they thought excellence looked like. I watched her from across the room for several minutes before I moved. She was halfway through accepting congratulations from a retired brigadier when I stepped beside her. 5 minutes, I said under my breath. We slipped into the hallway, carpeted quiet. A row of framed portraits lined the wall, each one watching us like witnesses. I pulled the folded printout from my jacket and held it up without a word. Her eyes flicked to the header, then to the circled timestamp. She didn't blink. "Did you send this A-beat past?" "2. "Yes," she said. She didn't offer a defense. No excuses, no denial, just the truth laid down like a surrender flag. Why her voice cracked even as she tried to control it? Because you left. You disappeared. And no matter what I did, they still. She stopped swallowing the rest. You weren't supposed to still matter. It wasn't anger in her voice. It was exhaustion, the kind born of years spent chasing ghosts and finding out too late they were still alive. I looked at her, really looked. The set of her mouth, the tremor in her hands, the child in her who used to trail behind me at family barbecues, desperate to be included. I didn't feel rage. I felt something colder. Clarity. "You sent that to erase me," I said quietly. "But that email could have buried both of us. You were lucky I found it first." Her expression didn't shift, but something in her posture folded inward like the scaffolding had cracked. I didn't wait for a reply. I slid the document back into my pocket and walked toward the exit, leaving her framed in silence under a wall of men who had likely never been betrayed by blood. The night air met me with its own kind of judgment as I stepped outside just before my phone lit up with a new alert. The alarm came at 0437, not a gentle buzz, but the kind that slices sleep in half. My phone glowed with a priority alert: confidential breach coordination center, immediate. No details, just a location, a directive, a weight I hadn't felt in years. I dressed in under 2 minutes. Muscle memory doesn't forget. By the time I reached the command center, the halls were already humming personnel in varying states of alert screens, lighting up like battlefield schematics. I gave my name at the checkpoint. The officer looked twice at his screen before waving me through. Inside, a grim-faced tech handed me a tablet. The file displayed was unmistakable candlelight, one of the most classified operations I'd ever led, and now fragments of it were floating across encrypted forums on the dark web. I scanned the breach logs, the entry point traced to an inactive device, one that used to be mine. Suspicion landed on me before I even sat down. I haven't accessed that system in years, I said, but I knew how these moments worked. The silence wasn't doubt, it was assessment. I requested full metadata access, pulled up routing tables. It didn't take long before something caught my eye: an outdated backup server triggered at the same moment the breach occurred. Not random, not accidental. Someone had activated a dormant process without knowing what it carried. I drilled into the log: credentials, timestamp, location, Cyrilla's. Her ID had pinged the system 2 days ago during a supposed training prep. I remembered her mentioning she left her laptop at the comm station overnight. Careless. But this wasn't sabotage. This was a spark that landed in dry grass. She'd opened a channel that should have stayed buried, and it had responded. The room around me blurred slightly as I closed the tablet and set it down. I wasn't the threat. I never had been. But now, the proof lived inside a digital breadcrumb, one that led straight to the person who had already tried to erase me once. General Karst didn't waste time with ceremony. He handed me the assignment like a weight I was already carrying. You know the systems. You know the people. And frankly, no one else has more at stake. Then he looked me in the eye. You'll lead. The internal task force was small, focused, uncomfortable. My father, Jarek, would oversee Intel archive records. He still held restricted clearance through his advisory post. My mother, Leona, was pulled in to assist with forensic trace analysis. Her medic's eye turned to data. Cyrilla was assigned access point verification. She didn't speak to me when we were briefed. She didn't have to. Her silence had evolved into a kind of brittle obedience. We sat around a rectangular table, no one quite meeting anyone's gaze. The room felt like a stage where each of us played 2 roles, family and function. I kept my voice measured clinical. We're not here to repair relationships. We're here to trace a leak. It took 3 days of sifting. Then I found it. An embedded Trojan tucked deep inside an archive node from 2017. Dormant. Never activated until Cyrilla's device pinged the wrong relay. A trap long forgotten, triggered not by betrayal, but by proximity. I stared at the date. 2017, Mosul. That was the year I clashed with Derek Glade, a strategist with a fondness for reckless sweeps and an ego as volatile as his tactics. I'd blocked one of his more aggressive civilian area operations. Publicly. The reprimand came quietly, but I knew I'd made an enemy. Now the malware whispered a signature. The pattern matched tools Glade once used. Cyrilla didn't create the breach, but she unlocked it. I looked around the table. My father was scanning the report with narrowed eyes. My mother's lips moved silently as she reread the file name. Cyrilla sat still, hands clasped, jaw tight. She knew. I spoke evenly. This wasn't sabotage, but it became one the moment we didn't check where we were standing. No one answered, but for the first time, my mother reached across the table and handed me a folder without a word. Cyrilla submitted the addendum quietly without announcement or delay. The language was clear, unembellished. She took full responsibility for initiating the chain of access that led to the breach. No excuses, no caveats. Just her name at the bottom, signed in firm strokes. The review board acknowledged the absence of malicious intent, but the consequences stood 5-year suspension of all promotion eligibility, effective immediately. She accepted it without protest. The next week, our father asked to speak at the closing meeting. He stood, cleared his throat once, and said, "I owe an apology to this team, but especially to Marlene." His eyes landed on mine, not with regret, but with something heavier. I let tradition outrank judgment. It was the first time he'd acknowledged what I'd always felt, that loyalty in our family had been measured in medals, not character. 2 months later, at a strategy conference in D.C., I was scheduled to present on post-conflict doctrine and asymmetrical response mapping. It was a room full of generals, analysts, and senior war college attendees. I opened my session with MAPS case studies, failures that had taught more than success ever could. And then I said, strength isn't in being right. It's in learning out loud. I turned to the side microphone and invited Cyrilla to the stage. She walked slowly but upright. No ribbons today, no bars, just a standard issue blazer and a yellow legal pad in her hands. She didn't look at me as she passed, but she didn't need to. She stood behind the lectern and cleared her throat. I grew up thinking leadership was about never slipping, about silence and polish. But I was wrong. I confused order with truth. Her voice didn't shake. Her gaze held steady. She didn't look for applause, and none came, just quiet, respectful listening. When she stepped down, she nodded once to me, to the room, to something unspoken. I felt no victory in that moment, only a shifting, a new shape to an old scar, a quieter kind of strength. After the session ended, I found a small envelope waiting on the table in my room. I set the table myself, no formality, no assigned seats, no printed name cards. Just 4 plates, 2 bottles of wine, and a silence I didn't plan to fill with pleasantries. I hadn't been back to the house in years. It still smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and shoe polish. But tonight it was just a room, not a stage. They arrived one by one, unsure whether to hug or nod, so we did both awkwardly. My mother carried a casserole dish wrapped in foil. My father brought nothing but a neutral expression. Cyrilla held a small white box she didn't open. When we sat, I didn't toast. I didn't wait for anyone to start. I reached beneath the table, lifted the folder from my bag, and set it down in the middle. Inside, printouts of the anonymous email, a map annotated with field notes, a photocopy of the commendation I declined after candlelight, my deployment logs, a timeline of everything they thought I had abandoned. No one reached for it. I didn't invite you here for apologies, I said. I just wanted you to see the parts of me you never asked about. My mother looked down. My father leaned back slightly, eyes fixed on the folder as if seeing a language he never learned. Cyrilla reached forward, opened the cover, and flipped through each page, slowly. When she finished, she closed it and slid it back across the table. My father cleared his throat. "There's a photo on the bookshelf," he said, "from that summer cookout." He stood, retrieved the frame, and stared at it. "This one's missing someone." He set it down and added simply, "Let's take a new one." We didn't smile for the camera, but we stood together in alignment. Later that week, a package arrived at my door. Inside, a small cake with white frosting. Written across the top in blue piping were 3 words, uneven but legible: general, sister, teacher. It didn't need candles. I sliced it quietly and set a piece on my own plate, then another on a second empty one across from me, not out of ritual but recognition.